When my father's will was finally read aloud, the silence in that room carried more weight than any applause my brother ever chased. He had believed the empire was his, shifting accounts and contracts while I stood in grief, too numb to argue. But the truth arrived on paper with my father's signature clear and final. My brother's smile disappeared as quickly as his certainty, because the empire he claimed had never been his to begin with. I watched his hands tremble when the judge pointed to the clause, the one my father had hidden carefully, reserving what mattered most for me. In that moment, years of sacrifice and patience returned to me like oxygen after suffocation, and I understood that my father had seen what I carried long before others mocked it as weakness. The humiliation I endured while relatives praised my brother suddenly transformed into clarity, because the empire rested not on charm or ambition, but on loyalty and steadiness. The ending was written long ago, hidden in a clause I never expected to need, and when it was spoken aloud, my brother's performance collapsed before everyone he once convinced. The day of my father's funeral felt less like mourning and more like a stage where my brother performed his role as heir before anyone could question him. While I stood at the graveside holding back tears, he shook hands with business partners, signed documents with prepared pens, and positioned himself as the new patriarch. Relatives whispered about how confident he looked, how ready he seemed, and I listened in silence while they ignored the fact that grief had left me unable to speak. He moved swiftly, transferring properties into his name and boasting that father had trusted him most, while I remained a shadow in the background, painted as the quiet son who lacked ambition. At the memorial dinner, he raised a glass, thanking everyone for their support, speaking as though the empire was already his, and the applause around the table stung sharper than any insult. I realized then that humiliation does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from those who know your sacrifices best and choose to erase them. I remembered nights spent working beside my father in dim offices, balancing ledgers long before Marcus even cared about the family business. And yet none of those hours seemed to matter when charm filled the room. My father had trusted me with operations when illness kept him in bed. But Marcus only appeared when cameras or relatives were watching, and still they called him decisive. I sat through that dinner replaying decades of loyalty dismissed in a single evening, each cheer for him echoing like proof that patience had made me invisible. He even dared to mock me gently, telling the guests that I preferred to stay behind the scenes, framing my steadiness as weakness, and the laughter that followed burned deeper than any argument could. I wanted to protest, to remind them of contracts I saved, debts I covered, and nights I guarded the family name when storms threatened to drown us. But I stayed silent. In that silence, however, clarity began to form. I noticed how quickly he signed documents, how casually he shifted assets without pausing, and I recognized the recklessness behind his performance. He believed speed would prevent questions, but I knew haste always leaves traces, and those traces would matter in time. My humiliation became fuel, sharpening my eyes, forcing me to watch every detail of his ascent. I noted the bank transfers announced too early, the contracts executed without proper witnesses, and the relatives who nodded nervously instead of clapping freely. I began to see the cracks forming in his empire even as it rose, and I realized patience would become my ally again. That night, I returned home not with anger, but with resolve. The family home felt colder without father's presence, but his study still held the scent of ink and leather, and I sat at his desk remembering the lessons he drilled into me. He had always said appearances fade, but paper endures, and I finally understood what he meant. While Marcus celebrated himself publicly, I opened drawers, pulled files, and began cataloging what my father left behind. Somewhere within those papers lay the truth of what father truly intended, and I promised myself that the humiliation I endured would not be the ending. It would be the beginning of a reckoning, carried not by shouting but by ink, signatures, and patience sharpened into a weapon. I spent the weeks after the funeral walking through the remnants of my father's empire, tracing the outlines of everything he had built and everything Marcus now claimed as his own. The offices smelled of dust and old paper, the halls echoing with footsteps of employees who now bowed to my brother's commands. But I knew their loyalty had been earned through decades of steady work beside my father, not through Marcus's sudden rise. I remembered nights when father and I sat at long tables under dim lights, reviewing contracts, correcting figures, and planning expansions while Marcus was still a boy chasing parties and praise. I had sacrificed more than youth. I had given my life to keeping the business alive during its leanest seasons, working late while others slept, carrying burdens no one else wanted to see. Yet when Marcus took the stage, those years disappeared. Relatives and colleagues acted as if my patience had been passivity, my silence weakness, and his charm strength. He told them the company thrived because of his vision, erasing every year I spent negotiating with creditors or guarding against collapse. I heard whispers that I had never wanted responsibility, that I had always chosen to stand in the shadows, and each rumor cut deeper because it spread so easily. I remembered covering payroll by selling personal assets, keeping workers paid when cash ran dry, and those workers never forgot my sacrifices. But now their voices were drowned by the clamor of Marcus's promises. One evening, I walked the factory floor alone, touching machines that still bore the marks of my father's hands. I saw welders finishing orders, men who had known me since youth, and I realized they remembered the nights I slept beside them to ensure deadlines were met. Their nods gave me strength because I understood loyalty was not erased by words alone. Marcus could paint himself as heir, but the true weight of responsibility lived in those halls, and that weight still clung to me. I carried memories of my father's lessons, that empires collapse without discipline, that appearances fade but sacrifice builds walls stronger than stone. At home, I sat at the desk in Father's study, surrounded by the scent of ink and leather, and reviewed the ledgers we had once studied together. I saw in those lines the proof of my contributions, the evidence of my loyalty, and I began to believe that silence would not be my end. I thought of the trust Father placed in me when illness weakened him, of the signatures I gathered to keep the business alive, and I knew that no performance could undo those records. I had been humiliated, dismissed, and mocked, but the paper remained, and in that paper I found the first signs of hope. It became clear that my brother's empire was built on spectacle, while mine was built on patience, and patience had left a trail of proof. I began to gather it quietly, organizing contracts, receipts, and testimonies that tied my hand to the survival of the company. I told myself that one day this truth would matter, because Father had never raised me to seek applause. He had raised me to endure, to preserve, and to wait until the moment when silence becomes stronger than any speech. My father's foresight revealed itself slowly, hidden in clauses I once dismissed as unnecessary, but now they stood like shields waiting for the right battle. Years earlier, before the company expanded into new markets, he insisted that all major estate documents include conditions protecting against reckless claims. I remembered sitting with him in the study, annoyed at the endless signatures and notarizations, but he told me that preparation was love expressed in ink. At the time, I laughed at the thought that family would ever need legal fences, because I trusted loyalty and I trusted blood. Now, standing in his study again after his death, I realized he had known better. Within a thick folder labeled with dates and initials, I discovered amendments to the will, buried behind routine papers, signed by my father's steady hand and witnessed by his advisor. The language was precise, clear, and merciless against the kind of arrogance Marcus now displayed. The documents separated pre-existing assets from shared ventures, reserving the core holdings under conditions of respect and demonstrated responsibility. I could hear my father's voice in the clauses about loyalty, about maintaining family honor, about not attempting to erase or diminish the role of those who built the foundation. Marcus had overlooked all of it, too busy chasing signatures of his own, and his carelessness gave me the first taste of calm after weeks of humiliation. I understood then that while he rushed to appear as heir, my father had already written a barrier that no performance could cross. I remembered the day Marcus signed one of those documents without reading it fully, treating the appointment as an inconvenience, mocking the thickness of the legal language. He had placed his name carelessly beside mine, never imagining that those strokes of ink would later define the boundaries of his downfall. That memory became my strength, because I realized his arrogance was not new. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to undo him. My humiliation transformed into clarity as I recognized that preparation outlives spectacle. I began scanning every page, storing them in multiple places, copying receipts of notarization, and cataloging witnesses who could verify authenticity. Each line I read brought me closer to the truth, that my father had not left his empire vulnerable to charm or recklessness, but had quietly armed me with the tools to defend it. I understood now why he had been so insistent, why he pushed for thoroughness even when I questioned his caution. He must have seen something in Marcus long before I admitted it to myself, and he acted with the discipline that I inherited but never valued until betrayal forced me to. Those documents became more than papers. They became the silent voice of my father speaking beyond his death. I felt his hand guiding mine as I organized them, and I promised myself I would honor his foresight. Marcus believed he had claimed victory in a single month of bold signatures and loud declarations, but he had already signed away his future in the quiet office of a notary years earlier. My father's wisdom lay hidden in those clauses, waiting for me to discover them when humiliation demanded proof. And as I placed the files back into the lockbox, I knew the war would not be fought in shouts or accusations, but in the calm weight of paper read aloud under oath. Marcus's pattern of betrayal became clearer with every passing week, not because he shouted it openly, but because his actions followed the same rhythm I had seen before. He invited relatives into the family home, using father's absence as an excuse to host gatherings that looked generous on the surface, but drained the accounts I once balanced carefully. He told them that supporting family was his duty, while I stood accused of being selfish for questioning endless requests. My silence, which had once been mistaken for patience, was now twisted into proof that I lacked compassion. Guests whispered that Marcus carried the family spirit, while I carried only suspicion, and their praise for him turned my warnings into further humiliation. I began keeping records again, not just of company ledgers but of household expenses, noting every spike in utilities, every sudden purchase justified as necessary, and every transfer of funds Marcus labeled as strategic. I recognized the cycle quickly. Money disappeared, excuses appeared, and blame settled on me when I refused to smile. He framed my refusal as cruelty, telling others I cared more for numbers than for people, and they believed him because performance always wins the first round. Yet I had lived long enough to know that performances collapse when weighed against evidence. The worst moments came when he mocked me in front of those who had once respected me. He turned my caution into a punchline, laughing that I still clung to old papers while he built empires with bold decisions. I felt the sting in those rooms, watching relatives nod along, too afraid of losing his favor to question him. But I also noticed their unease, the way some eyes flicked away when bills arrived, the way loyalty wavered when promises stretched too far. Betrayal does not happen in one grand strike. It grows slowly, disguised as generosity, until the weight of debt drags everyone down. At night, in Father's study, I compared the present to the past. I remembered how my father warned that power without restraint destroys itself, and I saw his words reflected in Marcus's every move. The pattern was unmistakable: reckless spending, staged generosity, and contempt for anyone who asked for accountability. I wrote it all down, line by line, date by date, because I understood that when the time came, memory would not be enough. Only records would matter, and I would be ready. In those quiet hours, I finally understood that my humiliation was not simply the result of Marcus's arrogance, but of my own refusal to accept patterns I had long recognized. I had always excused his recklessness, hoping he would grow out of it, but now the cost was too high. The empire father built was being siphoned away piece by piece, and only discipline could protect what remained. My role was no longer to argue or to seek approval, but to prepare, to gather the quiet truth that would one day outweigh his noise. Betrayal was becoming a system, and systems can be dismantled only with structure, patience, and proof. Marcus flaunted his supposed control with lavish gestures that looked like strength to outsiders, but revealed themselves as weakness to anyone who knew the cost of stability. He hosted dinners for potential investors where he promised impossible returns, speaking with the kind of confidence that dazzles short-term but destroys long-term trust. I attended one of those dinners and watched as seasoned partners nodded politely while hiding their doubts, and I recognized the same unease I had seen years ago when Father warned me that charm without discipline collapses quickly. Marcus confused applause with loyalty, believing that a round of clapping was equal to a signed contract, while I knew that true alliances are built quietly through years of consistency. Clients who had once relied on me began reaching out in whispers, asking if I was still involved, their voices carrying the concern of people who had invested more than money in our family name. I realized then that Marcus's arrogance was pushing away the very foundation he believed he commanded. He dismissed longtime employees who questioned his spending, replacing them with eager flatterers who lacked both experience and loyalty. Each dismissal became another fracture, widening the distance between appearance and reality, and I documented every one. I stored termination letters, notes from conversations, and even emails where he mocked those who had carried the company through its hardest years. I thought about my own past when I had faced similar whispers of doubt. Years earlier, an executive once cut me from a project claiming I was expendable, only to watch anchor clients leave with me because they trusted my discipline over his arrogance. That memory returned with clarity, reminding me that loyalty cannot be bought with spectacle. I saw the same shift beginning now, as older clients asked for private meetings, preferring my quiet assurances to Marcus's loud promises. I gave them no guarantees, only steady presence, and they repaid me with patience, waiting to see how events unfolded. Marcus taunted me openly, boasting that I was irrelevant, that history forgets those who refuse to take risks. I endured the mockery because I recognized that risks without calculation are not bravery, but recklessness. I wrote down each of his boasts, collected every brochure he released filled with exaggerated claims, and kept track of every client who quietly withdrew after meeting him. Evidence was piling up faster than he realized, and I began to see that the same arrogance that humiliated me would become the rope that pulled him down. The betrayal felt heavier each day, yet within that weight I discovered a strange calm. I no longer needed to defend myself with words, because Marcus's actions would condemn him far more effectively than my arguments ever could. My task was only to preserve the truth, to build the record, and to wait until the moment when silence could be broken by documents. He believed he was consolidating power, but I could already feel the ground shifting beneath him. What he dismissed as weakness, my patience, my records, my loyalty, was slowly becoming the shield that would outlast his empire of applause. I knew Marcus would eventually try to stretch his reach into intellectual property, because arrogance always believes it can claim creation without doing the work. Years earlier, Father and I had discussed patents, copyrights, and licensing agreements, and I had followed his instructions with quiet discipline, filing every document carefully, notarizing ownership, and storing receipts that proved I funded the filings myself. At the time, Marcus mocked my obsession with paperwork, saying creativity mattered more than contracts. But I understood that without proof, even the strongest idea can be stolen. Now that he believed himself the owner of everything, I could already see him circling around designs, blueprints, and contracts that never belonged to him. I spent nights auditing every record, pulling assignment ledgers and checking the chain of custody on prototypes that still carried my initials. I opened email archives that documented approvals, highlighting how I personally handled fees long before Marcus involved himself with the business. I read through board minutes where Father insisted on separating certain assets, and I remembered the day Marcus signed the forms without reading them, treating the moment as a nuisance. That careless signature had locked him out of rights he would later try to seize, and I smiled at the thought that his own impatience had undone him years before he ever began this performance. I began cataloging each piece of proof, photographing prototypes against newspapers, copying notarized contracts, and encrypting drives where the records would remain untouchable. I thought of the rival lawyers Marcus hired, confident they could pressure me, and I realized they had no idea how deep my preparation went. Intellectual property is not defended with arguments or performances. It is defended with signatures, dates, and receipts. I had all three, layered across years of diligence, waiting for the day they would be called forward. The betrayal still stung, but I understood now that my strength was never meant to shine in applause. My strength lived in structure, in the boring details mocked by others, and those details would stand like stone walls when Marcus tried to storm them. He believed power came from speed, but true power comes from foresight, and foresight had been my quiet companion all along. As I closed the lockbox on another night of review, I felt calmer than I had in months, because I knew that when the moment arrived, the empire he claimed would collide with the paper fortress he had signed without thought, and his arrogance would finally meet the weight of proof. I stopped answering Marcus's provocations, because every time I raised my voice, it only strengthened the picture he painted of me as bitter and weak. Silence became my protection, and instead of fighting, I focused on removing myself from the arguments entirely. I began with the basics, rotating passcodes on my accounts, redirecting mail to the office, and placing sensitive records into a secure lockbox where no careless hand could reach. At the bank, I opened a new account with quiet precision, ensuring payroll would remain safe while leaving nothing exposed for Marcus's sudden demands. At home, I changed my routine so the house itself reminded me that I was already living apart from him and his chaos. I set one bowl on the counter, one mug on the shelf, and kept only the essentials in the kitchen, as if marking the space for a single life. Marcus responded with louder gestures, bringing guests into rooms that once carried father's presence, mocking me by turning the place into a stage for his confidence. He told anyone who would listen that I had withdrawn because I lacked the strength to lead, while I knew the truth. That withdrawal was strategy, not surrender. I cataloged every purchase he made under the guise of emergency, recording the dates, amounts, and flimsy justifications he offered. I noted how his spending sprees always arrived after confrontations, like punishments meant to remind me of his control. Instead of protesting, I logged the evidence, building a timeline that revealed patterns he believed were invisible. The louder he became, the calmer I acted, because I understood that storms burn themselves out, but documents remain. In the evenings, I walked through Father's study in silence, running my fingers along the shelves and remembering how he taught me that restraint is not weakness, but discipline. Those lessons steadied me as I listened to Marcus shout in other rooms, his voice filling halls where paper would one day speak louder than he ever could. I realized that quiet separation was not about leaving the house physically, but about leaving the argument spiritually, refusing to let his noise draw me into his theater. Each small step built a foundation. Receipts tucked into envelopes, bank slips stamped and dated, photographs of property placed against newspapers for proof. I no longer sought to explain myself to relatives who praised Marcus, because I knew explanation without evidence is wasted breath. My strength was in the structure I built when no one was watching, the fortress of proof that would hold when performance finally collapsed. In silence, I separated myself from his games, and in that separation, I began to recover the dignity he tried so hard to erase. Depositions revealed the true battlefield, because Marcus no longer spoke only to relatives but to records that could contradict him. He claimed boldly that the company thrived because of his vision, presenting himself as the architect of growth while ignoring the years I carried operations through crisis. His lawyer added weight, suggesting that I had stepped back by choice, framing my patience as abandonment, and they both seemed confident that no one could challenge their narrative. I sat quietly, letting them build their stage, because I knew discovery would cut through their performance more effectively than anger ever could. The first cracks appeared when documents were requested. Contracts, invoices, emails, and their timelines wavered under scrutiny. I had prepared carefully, storing receipts of my involvement, correspondence showing my hand in negotiations, and dated signatures that proved I bore the real responsibility. Marcus stumbled when asked for proof of his contributions, producing vague statements and half-complete files that revealed his lack of diligence. The bravado that had carried him in social settings began to fade in the sterile light of evidence. Even more damaging was the digital trail he overlooked. I had collected emails where he mocked employees he later dismissed, notes where he admitted he had not read clauses before signing, and messages that revealed his reckless spending hidden behind claims of generosity. My counsel aligned each piece into a timeline that exposed the contradictions, and suddenly the image of Marcus as a decisive leader collapsed into something hollow. He tried to recover by accusing me of bitterness, but bitterness cannot create receipts, and bitterness does not notarize signatures. The weight of paper stood against him, and his voice no longer carried. I remembered my father's lesson that preparation is not about predicting betrayal, but about respecting time, because time always exposes the careless. That truth lived in the deposition room as Marcus shifted uncomfortably, realizing his haste had trapped him. His lawyer pressed forward, but even she looked strained as documents stripped the shine from their story. Witnesses confirmed details Marcus had tried to bend, describing how I was present in late-night meetings and negotiations while he was absent, and their words echoed louder than his protests. I left those sessions not with triumph, but with a calm certainty. The humiliation I endured when Marcus mocked me in public now seemed almost necessary, because it sharpened my resolve to build a record no one could erase. Discovery was not dramatic, but it was decisive, a steady dismantling of a performance that once seemed unshakable. I understood then that lawful revenge is not an explosion of anger, but the quiet alignment of truth, and I carried that understanding with me as the case moved closer to the final confrontation. The courtroom became the turning point, because unlike the memorial dinners or the loud gatherings Marcus loved, Here only paper mattered and performances held no weight. He entered confidently, dressed as though already victorious, smiling at relatives who filled the benches, whispering to Clara as though the case was only formality. His lawyer spoke first, laying out demands that reached for everything: half the empire, control of assets, authority over accounts. And each word felt like another attempt to erase the decades I had sacrificed. I sat silently, my hands resting flat, because I knew my strength would not come from speeches but from what I carried in a single folder. When their presentation ended, the judge turned to me, and I slid the document across the table without flourish. It was the addendum my father had signed years earlier, hidden among files Marcus never cared to read, and the ink was as sharp as the day it dried. The judge adjusted his glasses, reading aloud each clause that stripped away Marcus's claims, line by line exposing the empire he believed untouchable as nothing more than borrowed image. I watched Marcus's expression falter, his practiced confidence draining as the courtroom leaned into the silence that followed every sentence. Clara tried to object, suggesting misinterpretation, but the notarizations and signatures were unshakable. The paper bore Marcus's own careless signature beside mine, a mark he had once given without thought, dismissing it as routine. That same arrogance now cornered him, binding him legally to the very limitations he had mocked. The relatives who once clapped at his speeches shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding his eyes, others glancing toward me with expressions I had not seen in months, respect mixed with shame for believing his stories. The judge's ruling was calm, almost cold, striking down Marcus's demands with steady precision. He declared that the empire's foundations were secured under the clauses my father had prepared, that Marcus held no rightful claim to the assets he sought, and that his reckless transfers would be reviewed under separate proceedings. I breathed deeply for the first time since father's passing, not in triumph but in release, because the humiliation I endured had finally been answered with proof. I left the courtroom quietly, refusing to linger for reactions or whispers, because dignity does not require applause. My brother had staged his empire on noise, but it was undone by silence, signatures, and foresight. The humiliation he cast upon me in public was erased in a single hour where paper outweighed pride, and as I stepped into the hallway, I understood that this was not victory. It was restoration. The empire remained intact, not because I fought louder, but because I carried the discipline my father taught me, and discipline had finally spoken where words had failed. The aftermath of the courtroom decision unfolded in ways that revealed the true difference between noise and permanence. Marcus, who once filled rooms with confidence, now moved through the family circle with eyes lowered, his allies uncertain about whether to stand beside him or quietly retreat. Relatives who had praised his speeches began reaching out to me privately, offering apologies masked as concern, admitting that perhaps they had misjudged loyalty for weakness. I did not respond with anger, because I knew dignity grows strongest in silence, and silence was the one weapon Marcus had never learned to wield. Business circles reacted even faster. Clients who had hesitated to renew contracts under Marcus's inflated promises returned quietly, signing agreements with me after acknowledging they valued steadiness over spectacle. Longtime employees who endured dismissal or ridicule from Marcus reached out, asking if I still needed their skills, and I welcomed them back not with celebration, but with clear contracts that offered protection they had once lacked. The empire, which Marcus claimed as his own, began to rebuild itself around discipline and proof, not charm and applause. I did not boast about the court victory, because a victory spoken too loudly soon loses its strength. Instead, I let the signed order carry the story for me, and that story spread faster than gossip ever could. Marcus tried to salvage his image through social channels, painting himself as betrayed, telling whoever would listen that the law had turned against him unfairly. But the truth had already been recorded, notarized, stamped, and spoken in court, and his words no longer carried weight. Even Clara, his most loyal advocate, distanced herself quietly, refusing to risk her reputation defending a man who had ignored every warning. He was left with only noise, while I held the quiet certainty of legitimacy. At home, I walked again through Father's study, remembering his voice when he said that preparation is love written in documents. I understood now that he had seen this storm before it arrived, and he left me not only a legacy, but a shield. I sat at his desk, the order resting beside the old ledgers we once studied, and I felt the strange peace that comes when humiliation no longer burns but teaches. I did not think of revenge because revenge is noisy, but I thought of restoration, which is steady and final. The empire was never about applause or titles. It was about responsibility carried in silence, about sacrifice no one notices until it is threatened. Marcus had tried to erase that truth, but in the end, he only revealed it more clearly. And as I returned to work, signing contracts and greeting employees with calm steadiness, I realized that the greatest retribution is not destruction but survival. I had survived betrayal, humiliation, and mockery, and I now carried the family name forward without needing anyone to cheer. The days after the verdict demanded quiet rebuilding rather than loud celebration, because what mattered most was showing that the empire could still stand on discipline. I walked the factory floors where the hum of machines replaced the noise of arguments, and I felt a sense of stability returning to walls that had carried both my father's hands and my own. Workers who once looked uncertain now greeted me with nods of trust, their eyes telling me they valued steadiness more than speeches. I held short meetings, reminding them that their jobs were safe, that payroll would never falter, and that the chaos which haunted recent months had no place here anymore. In the office, I made deliberate choices that carried weight without spectacle. I reinstated older employees Marcus had dismissed, signing contracts that acknowledged their loyalty and protected their positions. I restructured spending lines, cutting away the lavish expenses he used for vanity, and redirected funds toward training and upkeep. Vendors and partners who had been hesitant began returning calls, not because of promises, but because of the signed court order and the reputation I carried for restraint. Slowly, the cracks he left behind filled with quiet order, and the empire steadied itself around routines I had defended for years. At home, I made smaller adjustments that reflected the same clarity. I cleared spaces in Father's study, organizing files into fresh binders, labeling each section with dates, contracts, and signatures, as though preparing for the future storms I now understood would always come. His portrait on the wall seemed to watch me, reminding me that preparation is never wasted. I thought about his insistence on foresight, how I once considered it overcaution, and I finally grasped its meaning fully. Betrayal may wound, but preparation ensures the wound does not become fatal. Relatives who once applauded Marcus now sought my presence carefully, sending messages framed as concern but carrying undertones of regret. I did not answer with anger, because forgiveness was not required and revenge was unnecessary. I simply gave them silence, and silence carried more dignity than any argument ever could. I understood then that reputation is not repaired through explanations but through consistency, and every day I lived steadily became proof stronger than words. The humiliation that once weighed like a stone on my chest no longer bound me. It had carved me into someone sharper, teaching me that calm outlasts outrage, and that lawful revenge is not about crushing another person, but about protecting what cannot be stolen. Marcus faded into the background, clinging to excuses that no one wanted to hear anymore, while I carried the family name forward with the steadiness my father entrusted to me. The empire remained intact not because I fought louder, but because I chose patience, built structure, and allowed truth to speak where noise once ruled. The courthouse steps were nearly empty by the time I walked outside, yet I still felt the weight of unseen eyes on me, searching for a reaction I refused to give. I kept my pace steady, because I understood that dignity is not measured by words spoken after victory, but by the silence carried in moments when gloating would be easy. The order rested in my briefcase, stamped and final, and its weight reminded me that years of humiliation had not been wasted. They had sharpened me into someone who could endure and prevail without rage. I thought of Marcus, how he once filled rooms with noise, surrounding himself with admirers who clapped at every careless promise, and I realized that his empire was never truly built. It had been borrowed from perception, from the willingness of others to believe charm over discipline. But paper had stripped that illusion away. I remembered how relatives once whispered that I was too cautious, too quiet, too unwilling to seize opportunity, and I smiled at the thought that caution had saved what mattered most. Their judgment had stung, but their absence now proved that loyalty bought by noise never survives silence. As I walked past the old office tower, I thought of the workers inside who would wake tomorrow to steady paychecks, unaware of how close their security had come to collapse. That was my father's true legacy, not the applause or the titles, but the responsibility to protect others even when no one applauded the sacrifice. Marcus had tried to erase that truth, mocking me as weak, but in the end, his arrogance only revealed the strength hidden in patience. Back at home, I placed the folder into Father's study drawer, returning it to the place where he had once shown me how preparation is love written in contracts. The room felt lighter now, no longer haunted by humiliation but steadied by proof. I touched the desk where he signed those clauses, and I whispered a promise in my heart that his foresight would never be squandered. I would guard what he left, not by seeking revenge against my brother, but by living the discipline he trusted me to carry. The humiliation that had once burned through me was gone, replaced by a quiet clarity. I did not need to explain, to justify, or to defend myself anymore. The truth had been recorded, spoken aloud, and preserved in the judgment that secured the empire. My brother's downfall was not my triumph. It was his consequence, and my role was only to protect what should never have been threatened. The story ended not with applause but with silence, and in that silence, dignity returned to me whole. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching, 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 you are watching.